The scissors made a sound I will never forget. Not the clean snip of fabric shears doing their honest work. This was something slower, deliberate, the way a person cuts when they want you to hear it. When I turned around, Marguerite Ashford Voss was standing in the center of the atelier, holding 8 inches of vintage French lace between her fingers, the cut edge already curling. She looked at me the way a woman of her standing always looks at a woman of mine, with the particular warmth of someone who has already decided you are not a problem worth solving. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, "you didn't actually think this was going to work." The fitting room smelled of cedar and French perfume and the faint chemical bite of dry cleaning fluid. I had been standing on the raised platform for 40 minutes while the seamstress, Celeste, worked pins into the hem of what was arguably the most extraordinary garment I had ever touched in 11 years as a textile archivist. It was a 1947 Balenciaga, not a reproduction, not an homage, a genuine surviving piece from the original house, on loan to me through a museum contact who trusted my hands with things most people were never allowed to breathe near. I had spent 6 weeks arranging the loan. I had driven it here myself in a temperature-controlled case. Marguerite had been in the room for 4 minutes before she found the scissors. Celeste made a sound like a small bird startled from a branch. I did not make any sound at all. That was the thing about Marguerite that I had taken too long to understand. She was not impulsive. She was not having a bad day. She had looked at that dress and made a calculation. The calculation was, if I destroy this, she cannot wear it. If she cannot wear it, the wedding becomes mine again. And in her world, the wedding was always supposed to be hers. Her son, her money, her event, her narrative. I was an inconvenience she had agreed to tolerate until she found a better strategy. She had just found one. I stepped down from the platform. I didn't rush. My hands were very still. I looked at the cut in the lace, and then I looked at Marguerite, and I thought about all the things I could say, all the truths I could have delivered right there, in front of Celeste and the two assistants now frozen near the curtain, and I chose not to say any of them. Not yet. I picked up the case. I set the dress inside it with the same care I always used. I closed the clasps. "You'll want to have your lawyer contact mine," I said. "The replacement value is documented." Then I walked out of the atelier, and the bell above the door rang twice, and I stood on the street in the pale November light and called the only person I knew who would understand what had just happened. Her name was Dr. Emmeline Voss, no relation, an irony I had stored away, and she was the senior conservator at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, and she had given me my first real position at 23, and she had never once spoken to me the way Marguerite Ashford Voss just had. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what happened. There was a silence on her end that felt like the silence of someone choosing their words with great care. "Where are you?" she asked. "Outside the atelier. Go home. Don't speak to the family tonight." "And Nora?" She paused. "How much of the collection has she seen?" I hadn't thought of it that way yet, but I thought of it then. "None of it," I said. "She doesn't know about the collection." Emmeline exhaled. "Then you're fine," she said. "You're more than fine. Go home." I had met Julian Ashford Voss at a conservation conference in Edinburgh 3 years earlier, in the kind of accidental meeting that people call fate, and I now recognize as probability. He was an architectural historian. I was presenting a paper on the material degradation of pre-war Parisian couture. He had come to the wrong room, stayed for the right reasons, and bought me coffee afterward in a place that smelled of rain and old books. By the second coffee, I knew he was exactly who he appeared to be: careful, curious, quietly in love with beautiful things, and by the third I knew I was in trouble in the best sense of the word. What he had not told me, not in any way I had properly understood, was the specific shape of his mother. I had met Marguerite 4 times before the fitting. The first time she had called me charming in a tone that made the word feel like a citation. The second time she had asked, without apparent cruelty, whether my family had any history in the arts, and when I described my grandmother's weaving, real work, Appalachian craft tradition, museum collected, she had nodded in the way that people nod when they want you to stop talking. The third time she had arrived at a dinner, Julian had cooked and spent the evening examining the apartment with the attention of a building inspector who had already written the report. The fourth time she had looked at the ring Julian had designed for me, an antique rose-cut diamond set in, oxidized silver, unconventional and exactly right, and said, "How utilitarian." I should have understood then, that word, how utilitarian. It was the most honest thing she ever said to me, because it told me everything about how she measured the world. Things were either pedigreed or functional, old money or new work. You either belonged to the correct category or you were furniture. I was furniture. But here is what Marguerite Ashford Voss did not know about me, because she had never bothered to ask, because the information was available if you knew where to look, and she had never looked. My grandmother had not just woven. My grandmother had collected. Quietly, methodically, over 40 years, acquiring pieces with the instinct of someone who understood what the market had not yet recognized: quilts, samplers, ceremonial textiles from a dozen traditions. Two pieces of documented 17th century Flemish needlework that had passed through a Flemish noble house. A collection that I had spent the last 4 years quietly cataloging, conserving, and, just recently, in conversations with three different institutions, preparing to donate in a partnership arrangement that would carry my grandmother's name on a permanent gallery wing. Marguerite thought she was cutting a dress. She had cut a dress, but she had not touched anything else. I went home. I did not call Julian that night, though he called me twice. I sat in my workroom with my grandmother's catalog spread on the table and the temperature-controlled storage humming in the corner, and I looked at 11 years of careful work, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not grief, not fury, something colder and more useful than either, and I started to understand exactly what was about to happen. Julian came the next morning. I had made coffee, which felt like the right gesture for a conversation that was going to require someone to be reasonable, and I was going to be the one who was reasonable. He sat across from me with the expression of a man who has been awake all night and has not yet found the words. She told me it was an accident, he said. I looked at him. She said the scissors slipped. I looked at him a moment longer. I said Celeste was in the room. He rubbed his face. I know. The assistants were in the room. I know. Celeste has been in that atelier for 22 years. Her hands do not slip. Julian put his coffee cup down and looked at the table. He was a good man. I want to be clear about that because the story requires it. He was a genuinely good man who loved me and was constitutionally incapable of believing that the woman who had raised him had looked at something I loved and destroyed it on purpose. Because if he believed that, he would have to do something about it. And doing something about it meant choosing. And he had spent his entire life in a family that did not require him to choose. I'll pay for the dress, he said. Whatever the value, the dress isn't the issue, I said. He looked up. The dress is just the thing she used. The issue is what she was trying to tell me. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a delivery truck was backing up, its warning signal tapping a slow and patient rhythm. I watched his face move through several things. Awareness, discomfort, something close to shame, and I felt sorry for him in the way you feel sorry for someone who is about to be asked to grow beyond what they've been prepared for. I need you to decide, I said. Not today, but soon. I need to know if you can defend me, not from her, just in general. I need to know if you can do that. He didn't answer, which was, itself, an answer. The wedding was in 6 weeks. The venue was the Ashford Estate in Gloucestershire. Marguerite's choice. Julian's agreement. My polite non-objection that I was now revisiting. 300 guests. A florist flown in from Amsterdam. A catering company that required a deposit larger than my first year's salary at the museum. All of it on the Ashford account, which had been established, as Marguerite liked to mention, in 1887. I had a meeting 2 days later with the director of the Harwick Museum of Decorative Arts, a man named Gerald Birch, who wore bow ties and had the warmest handshake in the conservation world, and we sat in his office with the collection catalog between us, and he told me, in the measured, quietly thrilled tone of a person who has been waiting for this conversation, that the board had approved the naming arrangement. The Nora Callahan Gallery of American Textile Arts, permanent installation, opening in 14 months. His institution's contribution to the partnership would cover all conservation, installation, and archival costs. The collection was, in his words, of national significance. I thanked him. I signed the preliminary agreement. I walked out into the autumn afternoon feeling the weight of something completed, something my grandmother had started and I had finished. And I sat in my car in the museum car park and I thought about the word utilitarian. I thought about it for a long time. Then I took out my phone and called the estate planner I had been working with for 3 years, the one who handled the trust documentation, and I asked her a specific question about the legal structure of the donation. And she told me something that made everything click into alignment, the way a very old lock opens when you finally find the right key. The trust is structured named me as founder, not the estate, not the family, me. By name, permanently. Marguerite had cut a dress. She did not know she had handed me a blade. I want you to understand the specific texture of the next 3 weeks, because it matters. I did not stop going to work. I did not stop eating or sleeping or seeing friends. I conserved a 19th century ecclesiastical vestment that had come to us from a private collection in Krakow. I gave a lecture to a group of graduate students about the chemistry of natural dye degradation. I had coffee twice with Emmeline, who had flown over from Paris on unrelated business and stayed longer than planned. And she asked me nothing directly but watched me with the attention of someone waiting for a wave to break. I was, to all outward appearances, a woman preparing for her wedding. The thing about a controlled reveal is the patience it requires. Marguerite operated in a world of immediate gestures. The dress, the whispered comment, the dinner table tone of voice that rearranged a room. She had never needed to wait because she had never needed to be careful. The world had always moved for her. I had been moving for a long time. I was done moving. The Ashford Estate pre-wedding gathering was on a Friday 36 hours before the ceremony. A dinner for the families and close friends, the kind of event that is ostensibly casual and is actually an opportunity for territorial display. I arrived in a car Julian had sent. I was wearing my own dress, silk, dark green, nothing remarkable to the uninformed eye. But I had made it myself over 4 evenings, from a bolt of fabric I had been saving for 10 years, and the cut was exceptional in the way that handmade things sometimes are when the person making them knows exactly what they're doing. Marguerite greeted me in the entrance hall with both hands extended and the warmth of a woman who had already won. "Nora," she said. "You look comfortable." She said it the way she said utilitarian. As a verdict. "Thank you," I said. I let her take my hands. I smiled at her. "You look well." There were 42 people in the room. Julian was across the hall talking to his university friends. His father, Reginald, was near the fireplace, a quiet man who had long ago stopped arguing with his wife and now moved through her social events like furniture that had learned to pour drinks. Gerald Birch was there because I had asked Julian to invite him, and Julian had agreed without asking why. Because Julian was trying, in the way that people try when they know they have failed and are not yet ready to say so. Gerald was standing near the window with a glass of red wine, and when he saw me, he made a small, private gesture that I understood to mean, "I'm ready when you are." The dinner was the usual kind: long table, candles, Marguerite at one end, Reginald at the other, Julian and I in the middle like a hyphen between two languages that did not translate. The conversation moved through the expected channels: the estate renovation, the travel plans, the achievements of children, and the health of parents, and Marguerite held the center of it with the ease of long practice. She was magnetic in those settings. She genuinely was, I can say that honestly. She turned to me somewhere around the second course. "I've been meaning to ask," she said in the tone of someone raising a pleasant topic. "What will happen with your work after? It seems like such an intensive vocation for a married woman." The table didn't quite go quiet, but it adjusted. "I imagine I'll continue," I said. "Of course," she smiled. "I only ask because Julian will have a great deal of social obligation once you're settled, and those kinds of positions get so demanding." The pause before demanding was surgical. "It might be worth thinking about something more flexible, something that leaves room for the life you're stepping into." Julian looked at his plate. I picked up my wine glass. I set it down. "Actually," I said, "I've just finalized a partnership arrangement with the Harwick Museum." I turned to Gerald across the table. "You were there, Gerald. Do you want to tell them, or shall I?" Gerald set down his fork with the contained delight of a man who has been waiting for this moment since the invitation arrived. "The Callahan Gallery of American Textile Arts," he said. "Named installation, 14 months to opening. The collection has been assessed by 3 independent appraisers." He looked at Marguerite with precisely calibrated pleasantness, "and the pieces are of national significance. We're quite honored." Marguerite's expression did not change. That was the tell. When a woman of her discipline loses nothing in her face, it means something has just moved in her chest that she cannot allow to reach the surface. "Callahan," said a woman across the table. "Julian's godmother, I think, a tall woman in pearls." "As in, your gallery?" "My grandmother's collection," I said. "I've spent 4 years preparing the donation. The trust names me as founder." I looked at Marguerite. My grandmother was a weaver. Appalachian tradition. Most people didn't know what she was collecting. They thought it was sentimental. I let that land. They were incorrect. Marguerite picked up her wine glass. I watched her hand. It was steady, I'll give her that. She was exceptional under fire, and she knew the table was watching. "How wonderful for you," she said. "A legacy project." "More than that," Gerald said. "Still warm, still pleasant, entirely on purpose." The Callahan pieces are already generating significant scholarly interest. We've had 3 documentary inquiries. A feature in the Textile Arts Quarterly is running in the spring. He looked around the table with the practiced sociability of a museum director who has attended 10,000 dinners exactly like this one. "Nora is one of the most significant private collectors of American decorative textiles in the country. We're very lucky she chose Harwick." Julian was looking at me, not at the table, at me. And in his face I saw something I had not expected. Not surprise, not discomfort, but recognition. The belated, aching recognition of a man who realizes that he has been standing next to something extraordinary without understanding what it was. I did not look away from him when I said, "My grandmother always said, the quietest things in a room are usually the most valuable. You just have to know what you're looking at." Marguerite's glass touched the table too hard, just once, just slightly. The sound was crystalline and brief, and only the people watching her hands would have caught it. I was watching her hands. The dinner continued. It always does. The candles burned down. The plates were cleared. People moved to the drawing room for drinks, and the conversation fragmented into smaller, less dangerous pieces, and I stood near the window with my own wine and watched Marguerite work the room with the efficiency of someone recalculating. She was very good at recalculating. She moved to Gerald, and they spoke for several minutes, and I could see from the set of her shoulders that she was gathering information, and I could see from Gerald's face that he was giving her none of it that she could use. Julian found me near the window at the edge of the evening. He stood beside me and didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the Ashford grounds were dark and cold and very beautiful in the way that old estates are beautiful, maintained and ordered, and carrying the weight of all the people who had moved through them before. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Would it have mattered? He thought about it honestly. I don't know, he said, which was the most honest thing he had said in weeks. I know, I said. That's why. He put his hand on my arm. I'm sorry. About the dress. About not defending you. I'm sorry, Nora. I looked at him. He meant it. I knew he meant it. I need you to be sorry in the way that changes something, I said. Not just in the way that feels better. He nodded. He didn't move his hand. The ceremony was on Saturday afternoon under a sky that couldn't decide between pewter and pale blue and finally chose both. I wore an ivory dress I had made myself, long-sleeved, simply cut, in a wool silk blend I had been saving since a trip to a mill in the Scottish borders 5 years ago. It was not a museum piece. It was not borrowed. It was mine, in every fiber. Marguerite arrived in the first car and stood at the entrance to the estate chapel and looked at me coming up the path, and I watched her try to find a verdict and come up empty. Julian was at the altar, looking at me with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. What happened next was a matter of timing. The vows were just finished, the real ones, the ones that mattered, when we heard it. The sound of vehicles, more than one, the kind of low, synchronized rumble that carries over a Gloucestershire November morning with a quality that makes people stop and turn. Julian's uncle, a retired diplomat, went to the chapel window first, then Julian's godmother, then everyone else one by one, as the sound grew specific and ordered. 30 SUVs, black, long wheelbase flying small flags from the front quarter panels. They came through the estate gates in a convoy that stretched the length of the drive and stopped in a neat formation in the forecourt. The doors opened. The men who stepped out were wearing the livery of a diplomatic security detail, and behind them came the woman I had called 2 weeks ago. Emmeline's contact, the one I had met once at a conference in Brussels, the one whose professional title required 3 lines in a formal document and whose family name was older than the Ashford estate by several generations. Her name was the Countess Marie-Louise de Wartenberg, and she was the chair of the European Textile Heritage Foundation. And she had come to witness the formalization of the Callahan Collection partnership, and she had brought her security detail, because that is what she always traveled with. And she had come to the wedding because I had asked her, and because Emmeline had asked her, and because she had read the catalog and wanted to meet the woman who had built it. Marguerite Ashford Voss came out of the chapel behind the rest of us. I felt her presence before I saw her. I turned around. She was looking at the convoy, at the flags, at the woman now walking up the path with the unhurried confidence of someone who never once had to perform her authority because it has never once been in question. Then Marguerite looked at me, and I watched the color, very slowly, leave her face. Nora, said Marie-Louise, taking my hands with genuine warmth in French, then in English. What a remarkable day. Emmeline sends her love, and the collection, she shook her head slightly, the way a professional does when they want to convey that a thing is genuinely beyond their expectations, is exceptional. Your grandmother would be very proud. I thanked her. I introduced Julian. I introduced Reginald, who shook her hand with the quiet pleasure of a man who had not expected the day to go this way. Julian's godmother was already visibly reorganizing her understanding of who I was. Gerald, who had driven up that morning, was standing near the chapel door with the expression of a man watching a piece of theater he had partially helped write. I did not introduce Marguerite. She introduced herself. She moved forward with the practiced confidence of a woman who has always been the most important person in a room and extended her hand. Marguerite Ashford Voss, she said, mother of the groom. We're so honored. Of course, said Marie-Louise. She shook the offered hand with perfect courtesy and turned back to me. Shall we go in? I understand there's a reception. Marguerite stood in the cold for a moment, holding a handshake that had already ended. The reception was in the main hall of the estate. Fires in both grates. Long tables. The florist from Amsterdam had done extraordinary things. I sat at the center of it all beside Julian, who held my hand under the table, with the grip of a man who has been clarified. And I talked with Marie-Louise about the collection and the gallery gala and the opening. And I ate the very good food. And I drank 1 glass of champagne, and I watched Marguerite move through the room with the specific smile of a woman recalibrating in public. She came to me once, near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned and Julian had gone to speak with his father, and I was standing near the window with Marie, Louise's deputy, a pleasant young man from Lyon who was very interested in the Flemish pieces. Marguerite appeared at my elbow with the timing of someone who had been waiting for an opening. The dress you're wearing, she said. Her voice was absolutely level. Is that archived? No, I said. I made it. She looked at it. The wool silk blend, the simple cut, the months of patience it represented. She was doing the arithmetic, the same arithmetic she always did, asking, where does this fit? What category? What value? And for the first time, I could see her arriving at an answer she didn't have a word for. It's beautiful, she said. It was the only honest thing she had ever said to me. I believe she meant it. Thank you, I said. I looked at her steadily, without warmth and without cruelty. I know what I'm doing, Marguerite. I always have. I left her at the window. I went to find my husband. The fires were burning low in both grates, and the hall smelled of wood smoke and cut flowers. And somewhere outside the estate, a fox was moving through the dark Gloucestershire fields, with no understanding at all of what had happened here. Today I found Julian talking to his father near the far door, and Reginald smiled at me with the uncomplicated pleasure of someone who has been waiting a long time for the right person to show up at the right party. And Julian put his arm around me, and I leaned into the warmth of it, and that was that. The gallery opened on a Thursday in February, 14 months later, in the way that institutional openings do, with speeches and wine and the careful lighting that makes old textiles glow. My grandmother's name was above the door in pressed bronze letters. The Callahan Gallery. 400 people came. Gerald gave the opening remarks. Marie-Louise attended, though not with the full convoy this time. Just two cars and a genuine warmth, and a long conversation with a young textile scholar from Leeds who had written her thesis on Appalachian weaving traditions and could not believe she was standing in a room built around a collection she had studied from afar. Marguerite was not invited. I had considered it briefly and decided against it, not out of cruelty, but because the gallery was not about her. Nothing I did, from that day forward, was about her. That was the actual victory. Not the convoy, not the introduction, not the look on her face in the cold November forecourt. The victory was the moment I stopped organizing my life around her verdict. Julian came with me. He held my hand through the speeches and stood beside me when the curtain came down from the gallery entrance and the bronze letters were revealed. And when I looked at him, he was looking at the letters too, and his expression was the uncomplicated expression of someone who finally understood what they were standing next to. We stayed until the last guest left. I turned off the lights myself. I walked through the empty gallery once in the quiet, past the quilts and the samplers and the two Flemish pieces in their climate-controlled case, past all of it, 40 years of my grandmother's careful seeing, and I felt the weight of the completed thing, and it was very clean and very quiet and exactly enough. If you've ever been made to feel small by someone who assumed you had no ground to stand on, if you've ever held your tongue when you could have said everything and then found exactly the right moment to say it, then you already know how this ends. You don't always need to destroy someone. Sometimes you just have to make what is true undeniable in front of the right audience and let the rest arrange itself. If that story is yours in any version, leave a comment. I want to know what you did with the blade they gave you.